Hello, this is Robin Stalkup, and this is part one of a two-part pre-recorded training on graduation and dropout reporting. It will focus on exit adjustment and an overview of the grad drop reports. Part two of this training will go into more detail on rates and the validations. Part two will be posted hopefully by October 15th. During the pandemic, I have been teleworking off-site, so calling my office number listed on this slide is not the best way to reach me. The best way is to send me an email, and I can call you back on my cell phone if you need a phone call. You can also try the switchboard number 503-947-5600 and reach me that way, because then they'll email me. I supposedly have the email set up so that if I get a voicemail on my work phone, it goes to my email, but I know people have called the work phone and I haven't gotten any emails, so I don't think that that's working. So, but I am available and working regular hours, just from home. Okay, so today in part one, we're going to discuss exit adjustment. We're going to discuss calculated in-date codes and ADM program type 14 records, graduation and dropout reporting, basically an overview, not too much detail. Then we're going to talk about some frequently asked questions for data submission, and then what you should be doing to prepare for exit adjustment and to prepare for the NCES dropout and graduation validation and the cohort 4-year and 5-year validations. So those all open up on October 22nd. So I have a list of instructions toward the end of the presentation on what you should be doing to prepare, so you'll be in good shape. So now more than ever, with all of the trauma and change that has gone on over the last year, now more than ever, we stand up for equity in partnership with our districts, our schools, our ESDs, and our community partners. Every student deserves access to a high-quality, well-rounded education and to be able to achieve graduation with a plan for their future. We recognize that educational equity has been really highlighted in a bad way in some cases by the pandemic and the other trauma that we've had in our state with forest fires and other and the economy. And so education equity is the equitable implementation of policy, practices, procedures, and legislation that translates into resource allocation, education rigor, and opportunities for historically and currently marginalized youth, students, and their families, including civil rights protected classes. And this means we need to restructure and dismantle systems and institutions that created that dichotomy of beneficiaries and the oppressed and the marginalized. So the exit adjustment window for annual ADM for 1920 begins on October 8th, 2020, and it closes on December 4th, 2020. Now the final date for any changes to be counted toward the cohort or NCES rates is December 11th, 2020 at 11:59 p.m. That is when the validations close. So please get your changes in there. The purpose of exit adjustment is a look back into annual cumulative ADM for the 1920 school year, and that allows you to edit certain fields relating to student outcomes that are mainly used for graduation and dropout reporting. Now this means you can't submit new records in exit adjustment. You can only edit ones that you've already submitted, and you can only edit a few select fields in those records. Now, if you need to add new records or edit other fields in that record or in an existing record, you can contact your regional ESD partner or Amanda Leopard and request to have the full annual ADM collection reopened for 1920. I can also reopen that for you if needed. For program type 14 records, you can also add them to first period cumulative ADM for 2021. And we're going to discuss the situations where you will want to add a record, a type 14 record, or which collection you will want to put it into. Okay, so today, not today, the editable fields for exit adjustment are ADM in-date code, ADM in-date, ADM diploma type code, withdrawal factor codes, and all essential skill codes and dates. Now that I said optional for 1920, and this is to reflect that essential skills were suspended for 1920 and for 2021. The state board passed a rule on that just last week. So these essential skill codes are not going to be required for graduation in 1920 or 2021. However, there will be some of your students who have met those essential skills, and you'll want to put their data in since you have it, and so you can report them if you have them. If you don't have them, but you need to report something, you will put in a non-applicable code, and I'll show that in a couple more slides. Now, if you need to change any of the other fields in annual ADM, you will need to open the full ADM collection outside of exit adjustment. And when annual is open in consolidated collections, the exit adjustment option goes away, and you won't see that on your screen. So how do you get in and start making edits and exit adjustment? So exit adjustment, you're going to get into just like you would get into a collection in consolidated collections. You go to the secure login in the district website, you choose consolidated collections, and then you choose student collections. That's the first tab at the left at the top, and then you're going to click on ADM exit adjustment and choose record management tab, and then finally the record maintenance option on the drop-down menu. There is no web submission and exit adjustment, but record maintenance can be viewed if you need it. Now this slide shows the record maintenance view that you're going to see on your screens, and you can edit, like I said in the last slide, the ADM in-date codes, ADM in-date, ADM diploma type codes, and withdrawal factor codes, and those are actually in the upper portion of the exit adjustment, and then the essential codes are down here in the lower portion of exit adjustment screen. And so we'll talk about, oh, and then down here, if your student has a calculated enrollment in-date code attached to that record, you're going to see it down here. Okay, and we're going to go over calculated in-date codes in a lot of detail through this presentation. All right, so there are two options for updating data. You can do the record maintenance for individual students, or you can do a file upload. And file upload is, there's some constraints on file upload, and that is the uploaded records must match key fields. So there can't be any mismatches in key fields. Uploaded records will update only the editable fields in the record that they match, the editable fields allowed for exit adjustment. All the other changes will be discarded. So if you make a change in a race ethnicity flag or a tag flag or something else in ADM, that change will not be accepted in a file upload for exit adjustment. Uploaded records will only, so let's see. Sorry, I kind of got lost in my presentation here. So for 1920, you should be using for the file uploads the current ADM file format. and that was updated for 1920. So when you upload those records, you will not receive notices if the changes do not go through. So you're going to want to make your file uploads, and then you're going to want to look at your production downloads to make sure that those changes were accepted. All right, so this slide shows cutoff dates for editing records in exit adjustment. And these are for entering credentials, which are represented by ADM INDATE codes that start with 4, with one exception that we're going to discuss later. And so that would be 4A, 4C, 4E, 4F, and 4G. If that credential was awarded or earned prior to July 1st, that could have been a prior school year before the 1920 school year, then you're going to report that as a program type 14 record. And we're going to go into a lot of detail on program type 14 during this presentation. If the credential was earned within the 1920 school year, between July 1st, 2019 and June 30th of 2020, then this is something that you can change and show those credentials in exit adjustment. Or you can also do a program type 14 if that student had not been enrolled immediately prior to receiving the credential at your district. If the student got the credential after on July 1st or after in 2020, then you're going to want to enter them as a type 14 record in first period cumulative ADM for 2021. And in this slide, the later actually indicates that October 1st would be the later date. So if the record comes in after October 1st, then they're going to need to be entered into a different period than first period. And of course, if you enter any records in first period, you need to continue them on in second, third, and annual cumulative ADM for that school year. All right, so this slide goes on to inclusion of records and inclusion in exit adjustment edits for kids who transfer out or are deceased or permanently incapacitated. These students will have INDATE codes of 2A, 2B, and 2A is a transfer to another public district in Oregon, 2B, which is a transfer to private school or homeschooling, 2C, which is a transfer out of the state or out of the country, but you know through your documentation that the student is enrolled in a school at that other location out of state or out of the country. 2D are transfers to juvenile detention. 5C are United States students who are doing a foreign exchange program and at a foreign school, but are expected to return home. And 6A, these are students who are deceased or permanently incapacitated and will not be returning to school. So if these students, their last enrollment was prior to the 1920 school year, this could be the 1819 school year or before, you received that documentation prior to October 15th of this year, 2020, then you're going to report them as a program type 14 record. During the 1920 school year, if you receive that documentation 30 days after they were last enrolled at your district, that is a student who you can edit outcomes with in exit adjustment. If you received those records more than 30 days after their last enrollment at your district, but during last year's 1920 school year, then you're going to need to do a program type 14 record and report them that way. A student was enrolled through the end of 1920 school year, and you received their documentation prior to October 15th, that's also a student that you can edit fields in exit adjustment and report their outcomes. Students who were enrolled through the end of the 1920 school year, but you received the documentation late on or after October 15th, 2020, then they're going to need a program for type 14 record in second period because they've missed first period. Those records came in during second period. And so then you're going to put a program 14 record for second period, third period, and annual. So you just saw the last slide, and a lot of slides in this presentation are very busy and very full of information. And you know, we're not expecting you to be experts and to have instant recall of every slide. And but we are going to try to give you some resources where you can get help and get some advice. And the best resource we have are the regional ESD partners. They represent decades of experience in public schools in Oregon and data submission. Amanda Leopard, who is the data owner for ADM, myself, Robin Stalkup, I'm the data owner for cohort graduation and NCES dropout and graduation. And so we are resources for you. You can always shoot us an email, you know, call the regional ESD partners. And throughout this slide, I've tried to give some links to guidance. And at the end of the slide, I have a resource slide that shows a lot of the manuals and guidance for these validations and for exit adjustment. But I couldn't fit all the links onto that last slide. And I couldn't fit all the links onto this busy slides that discuss the cumulative ADM end date codes. So I have this slide as a reference slide for you. The first line represents a lookup tool for cumulative ADM end date codes. And the second URL is the guidance document for like an expanded discussion of when to use the end date code 4F for students that have met some graduation credentials. And so when do we use that 4F? So those are here. I also have the end date lookup URL on a couple of their slides. Okay, so students who are receiving a regular from modified diploma may have the appropriate essential skill codes reported in ADM. The rules originally required that records indicating an award of a regular or modified diploma to a student with a high school cohort of 2008 to 2009 or later, and that is everybody in our high schools, must reflect the appropriate essential skill codes. However, in light of the current pandemic and state of emergency, essential skills have been suspended for the 1920 and 21 school year graduates. Entering data into this field is optional. However, there may be some students who did meet the essential skills prior to graduating, and you may choose to enter their essential skills results, but be careful to accurately report the method used to demonstrate the mastery of those essential skills. Now, for reporting students who don't have essential skills, you know, if they've met every other diploma requirement but essential skills, they should be awarded a diploma if they've met all the requirements. Those students could be reported with a 0 value in graduation records requiring an essential skill, and that 0 value is non-applicable. And the URL at the bottom of this slide is for the original information about essential skills. Now, if you're having some questions or problems with reporting essential skills and how to enter that data, you can also contact your regional ESD partners for help. Okay, so there are basically ODEs making guesses with our calculated end date codes. And our best guess of what a student's actual end date code should be is based on all of the information submitted to us in ADM. So ODE produces one calculated in-date code per student in annual cumulative ADM with an enrolled grade of 7 or higher based on that student's reported enrollment in annual cumulative ADM for 1920 and then the first period cumulative ADM for 2021. So those calculated in-date codes attach to the latest record that we have for that student. That could be a record that your district submitted, or it could be a record that someone else submitted if the student was returning to a different school or institution. The calculated in-date codes attach to their latest record, and they do not attach to a record with ADM program types of 2, 3, or 5. And that calculated in-date code attaches to the record in annual. These calculated in-date codes are refreshed nightly. Calculated in-date codes are only attached to their last record. So like I say, if the student doesn't have a calculated in-date code in grade 7 or higher for you, and you just didn't edit your annual ADM record today before the refresh could happen at midnight, it means you do not have the student's last record. Someone else does. Other people making changes on records could be affecting your students in your cohorts. So to calculate the calculated in-date code, we only look at the last annual record and the first record in first period, and we use an algorithm. But this algorithm does not cover every conceivable scenario of enrollment. And we think they're probably only about 50% accurate, maybe a little higher than that in some cases. But we want you to be very cautious in accepting the validity of these calculated in-date codes. Don't take them as gospel, okay? They're good. We want you to be able to use them as tools and a good place to start in verifying and investigating your own student records for cohort and dropout rates. So 2 ways to find what the calculated in-date codes are is one, to look in record maintenance, and we showed you this screen just a few minutes ago. And the calculated in-date code for this student would be at the bottom here. And this would be showing for individual students. If you want to look at groups of students, then you're going to want to get a production download. And production downloads are under the Reports tab in Cumulative ADM. And you're going to select, be careful to select the right year, which will be Cumulative ADM for annual 1920. And also you want to make sure the collection you're picking is cumulative average daily membership, not average daily membership. That's an older collection that's obsolete. But this is the current one, cumulative average ADM, sorry, cumulative average daily membership, cumulative ADM. And be sure then you pick the right period, which is annual, and the right year, which is 1920. And there are all sorts of reports you can pull. ESL and PNP pull weighted ADMs. You can usually do an external or internal download. And for exit adjustment, there are 3 special production downloads. You can just download records that have a calculated in-date code. You can just download records that have the calculated in-date code of 3F, which is a dropout. Or you can just download records where the student's calculated in-date code does not match the in-date code that you submitted in the record. So you can look at those mismatches and figure out what's going on. The staff should always, your staff yourself should always review all records reported as graduates to make sure all of the students actually received their diploma. Every year we have a few students reported by error as graduates who unfortunately did not make it to their diploma. This year and next year, it is vital to report the data as accurately as possible so that your local and state leaders can see the full extent of the impact of so much trauma and change that we've experienced this year. So basically, ODE searches through the records that have been submitted to us to find out what we think the outcome for a student should be. This is not, like I say, not necessarily accurate, and it should only be used as a helpful tool to research what might have happened with that student. It might highlight mistakes in your data, or it might help you figure out if a student showed up somewhere else. Okay, so the calculated intake codes are just suggestions. We do not actually use these in our calculations. We do not report them anywhere. And this is why it's important to actually go in to exit adjustment and correct your ADM intake codes in cumulative ADM. These codes, these calculated codes, are not the final authority. They don't count as documentation. And if you see a student went to another district by a calculated intake code, say you thought that they were a 3F of a dropout, but then they show up as a 2A, which means they transferred to a district in Oregon, you still need to get a records request from that district in order to change your submitted ADM intake code. So the next two slides, I'm going to go through some of the most common codes for calculated intake codes. And those are 1A. This means a student was reported in first period cumulative ADM as attending your same school and district. 1D means the student did return. They just went into a district program at the district level program at the same district they attended before. 2A is used when a student is reported in a first period cumulative ADM as attending an accountable district or an ODE sponsored charter school, and that's based on the earliest first period record. If you have documentation that the student transferred to another Oregon Public School District, you may change the ADM intake code to 2A. If you are expecting a 2A, but see a 3E or 3F instead, check to make sure that the receiving district did not create a new SSID for that student. As long as you have the required documentation of a transfer as specified in cumulative ADM in the manual on page 45, you can keep the ADM intake code as 2A. You don't need to make a change. 2D means the student was reported in first period cumulative ADM as attending a JDEP. 2 question mark means that the student was reported in first period cumulative ADM somewhere else. So it may not fit one of the categories that we've mentioned so far. If you see a 3E or a 3F, the student was last enrolled after May 15th, 2020 for 3F or before May 15, 2020 for 3E, but did not either re-enroll in first period cumulative ADM or report a different outcome in annual. So wherever the student had been, they were not reported as transferring out to homeschool, for example. They did not graduate, and they do not have a more specific dropout code. 3E and 3F mean that we don't really know what their status is and what happened to them. And then we use May 15th when we make these estimates to basically stand in for the end of the school year, because not all schools end on the same day. So May 15th is a good sort of just a good kind of marker date. Say, okay, if it was before May 15th, they're in school. If it's after May 15th, we'll just call that the end of the school year for our calculations. And realistically, 3F should only be used if the student finished the school year with you. So if your school year ended on June 15th and they're a 3F, okay, they finished the whole school year if they left school on June 15th. Now, if the student is really a dropout, it's important to make sure that their ADM end-date code accurately reflects this. The calculated end-date code is provided in order to assist districts with validation, but it's, again, not used in any reporting. Okay, students whose annual ADM record indicates that they earned a regular or modified diploma are going to have one of these end-date codes, 4A, 4F, and 4G. These are based on high school entry year and enrollment in first period cumulative ADM, or if they're in grades 7 through 8. Now note that these are suggested codes. If the calculated end-date code differs from the ADM end-date code that you've reported, we recommend that you carefully review your records. And again, I put the end-date code lookup and 4F guidance URLs here for your reference. So, to talk about the differences when you use 4A, 4F, and 4G, type 4F means that a student completed all or part of a diploma track, and usually it means they earned a diploma. There's one code that we'll talk about later, 4B, that means they didn't earn a diploma. But if the student is not expected to return, so they walked with their class, they got their diploma on stage, well, not on stage in this year, but they're not expected to return, they're moving on with their life, you're going to use 4A. If this student was expected to return, but does not, you must award their diploma, and that would be a 4A or a 4G in those cases. 4F records must always be followed by continued enrollment or the award of a credential. If a student has been enrolled in high school for 4 or more years, you should not be using 4F. 4A with diploma type code 1 may not be followed by any enrollment record that claims state school funding. 4G may not be followed by any enrollment record claiming state school funding other than ADM program type code 16, which is postgraduate scholars. And we don't get too many of those. Program type 14 records should only follow 4G ADM end-date codes. Okay, so throughout this presentation, I'm going to be reading some scenarios and then discussing what actions or non-actions that you should be taking. So this student was enrolled in your district in 9th grade through May 29th, which was the last day of school for you. You would code them as 1A because you expect them to return for the next school year. When you look in exit adjustment, you see that the student's calculated end-date code is 3F. You should review your records to make sure you didn't forget to submit the student to first period ADM in 2021, which is our current school year. Assuming they really didn't return, review your records to see if you have evidence of another outcome for that student, that they graduated, or they left the state, or transferred somewhere. If you don't find any of those other outcomes, you should also review your records just to verify whether the student completed the school year or not. And if you have an explanation for the dropout, like exceeded age limits, that could change your codes. If the student did not complete the school year, you must change the student's ADM end-date code to 3A, 3B, 3C, 3D, or 3E. If none of these conditions in 1 through 3 have been met, and the student finished out the year and they didn't re-enroll and you don't know what happened to them, you must change the student's ADM in-date code to 3F because you expected them to re-enroll, but by October 1st, they had not. It's important that you never leave a record with ADM in-date codes of 1A, 1B, 1C, or 1D if the calculated in-date code is a 3E or a 3F. Because if the student were to show up if the student showed up in first period, they would not have these calculated in-date codes of 3E or 3F. If they're missing from first period, they're going to have these 3E and 3F codes. Okay, so this scenario, a student was enrolled in your district in 10th grade through January and then stops attending. You'll notice through January, this is while the 10-day drop rule was still in effect, and you code them as 3E, dropout status unknown. And then when you're logging into exit adjustment, you see a calculated in-date code of 2A for this student. And this indicates the student did enroll somewhere else by October 1st of 2020. And this is something where we want to highlight this catchphrase of it's not documented, it can't be reported. And this is something that I and one of the regional ESD partners came up with this year. I used to work for a organization, and that was their catchphrase, is if it's not documented, it's not done. And so in this case, we want to make sure that you always have the required written documentation to document outcomes. And so we're hoping that you think about this catchphrase as you're doing your work. If you don't have the documentation, it can't be reported. So you want to review your records to make sure that you have documentation of a transfer, written documentation, could be a records request. And unless you have that required documentation as specified in the ADM manual, do not change the ADM in-date code in exit adjustment. Okay? You have to be able to support your ADM in-date codes with documentation. Now, sorry, I put the wrong notes down. So we also want to note at this point that being claimed in the SSID system does not count as documentation. And again, I want to point out with this example, after the pandemic conditions in 1920, the 10-day drop rule does not apply, did not apply, and in 2021, the 10-day drop rule still does not apply. So some of these examples might seem a little strange for this year, but that would be the case for a student that was enrolled before the state of emergency. All right, moving on to the next example. A student was enrolled in your district in 12th grade through May 29th, which was the end of the school year for them, at which point they graduate. You code them as 4G because the student is eligible for postgraduate scholars, and at the time they are interested in participating. So when you check exit adjustment, you see a calculated in-date code of 4A because the student was not reported as returning. Okay, you should review your first period records to make sure you didn't forget to submit the record. Review records for postgraduate scholars enrollment because this student could have a postgraduate scholars program in course courses that begin after October 2nd. So it's important that you leave the in-date code as 4G if the student is going to start postgraduate scholars later in the school year. However, if they're not missing from first period because they didn't come back, they're not missing from postgraduate scholars because they didn't get enrolled in that program, if neither of those conditions are true, then you must change the student's in-date code to 4A. And you also might see this situation if you submitted a program type 14 record as a placeholder in first period for the student, but you haven't entered their information yet. This is a good time to update those program type 13 records in first period, so you don't run into any of these mismatches. All right, so a student was enrolled in your district in 10th grade through May 29th, at which point they leave your district. 1 week later, you receive a records request from a neighboring district. So you code the student 2A because you have your documents in hand. When you check exit adjustment, you see a calculated ADM in-date code of 3F because the student was not reported as returning in first period. You should review your transfer documentation. If you have the appropriate required documentation, leave the ADM in-date code as 2A. But it's possible that the receiving district created a new SSID in error for this student. And so you'll want to follow through and check for duplicate SSIDs so that this student's records can be merged. If you do not have the appropriate documentation of the transfer or another outcome, you must change their ADM in-date code to 3E or 3.4, depending on when your school year ended and when the student left. Okay, so some common scenarios, we've kind of touched on these in the scenarios. If your student has a calculated in-date code of 3E or 3F, but the in-date code that you show is 1A through 1D, you're going to want to change your ADM in-date code. Or if the student did return, you need to add records to first period cumulative ADM for 2021. If you see calculated in-date codes of 3E and 3F, and your in-date code says, your submitted code says 2A, you must change these in-date code, your in-date code, you must change your ADM in-date code. I'm sorry, I wrote this kind of funny in the square there. If you don't have appropriate documentation, okay? If you don't have appropriate documentation, you have to change this. If you do have appropriate documentation, you leave it alone, okay? So 3E, you'll just want to check to make sure that student finished out their year, and if they didn't, you want to recode that. Now 3E and 3F are treated differently in our grad drop calculations, so please use the correct 3E or 3F. It does make a difference, and we want you to have the most accurate rate for your graduation and dropouts as you can have. And we also use, just to remind you, we also use May 15th to calculate which of these 3E or 3F, and that may not jive exactly with your own school end date. So what you have locally as your school end date is the correct end date for that student if they finished out the year. So, you know, don't be too concerned if you have a 3F and we show as a 3E. Oh, sorry, did I say that backwards? So you're showing a student as a 3E and we show it as a 3F because maybe they left on May 15th and or May 16th, but your school year ended, say, June 16th. So your local information is more accurate in that case for coding their dropout status. And again, I put the URL for the lookup codes down at the bottom of this slide. Okay, so calculated end date codes. These are some tips. You should complete your first period cumulative ADM before starting exit adjustment. And you should probably give it a day to get copied into our operational databases before you actually start working on it. So those calculated end date codes can be updated appropriately. Don't assume that the record's calculated end date code is necessarily the most appropriate code for that student. Only make end date code changes that are supported by your school and district data and documentation. This is going to help you, and it's going to help your colleagues at other districts as well. Remember, the calculated end date codes are 50% accurate, probably for sure, but maybe not much higher than that. So contact your regional ESD partner if you need to make edits to locked fields and to add new records to annual cumulative ADM 1920. Again, Amanda Leopard or I can also open those collections if you know what you're doing and you just need them open. All right, so we're going to go through a brief overview of ADM program type 14 records. These records can be used to submit diplomas, other credentials, and some non-credential outcomes, both for the current year and for prior school years. They are non-enrollment records, and ADM program type 14 records must be submitted by opening up annual ADM or adding to first period cumulative ADM, depending on the date of the outcome. Okay, so there are two times that you want to use a program 14 record. If the outcome occurred and it was not accompanied by enrollment, and that could be an example of a summer diploma. It could also be reporting some past event, or a credential or an outcome occurred in a prior year. Sorry, I was just getting to that one. The second thing is a credential or outcome occurred in a prior year, but somehow it got missed and it now needs to be reported. So those are the two circumstances where you would use the program type 14 records. Be very careful when adding these records because you must use the actual event date in most cases. So if it's a graduation credential, you must use the actual date that credential was awarded. Using a date that's too late or too early may cause a record to be inaccurately excluded from this year's calculations. And one thing I do to prepare for the exit adjustment and validations is I look at people's annual ADM records versus their first period program type 14 records and see if there are any mismatches of data or if there are missing program type 14 records that were entered in first period but then not entered in annual. And that's very important because we only look at annual for the cohort years to determine outcomes. So those records need to be carried through. If you enter at first period, you're going to enter it at second, third, and annual for that year. All right, so program type 14 records only allow these codes. I'm not going to list them at this point. Allowable dates are going to be anything from July 1st, 2015. That would be the earliest date for 5-year cohort through October 1st, 2020, which is the last day of first period in 2020. So if the records have dates that are after June 30th of 2020, then they're going to be reported in first period cumulative ADM for 2021. Okay. ADM program type 14 requirements, no more than 1 weekday between the ADM enroll date and the ADM end date. These are just non-enrollment placeholder. You're giving information about what happened for a particular year and a particular date. The session days, days present, days absent, FTE, and instructional hours should all be 0. The tuition type for this record should be P, which is paid. For graduation reporting, this record should be the most recent record date. There should be no further records for this student unless they re-enrolled for further education. So a student is enrolled with you from September 2nd, 2015 to April 10th, 2016. The student leaves and you don't know where they've gone. So you report them with ADM end date code of 3E because they dropped out, you don't know where they went, and they left before the end of the school year. While reviewing your cohort records, you discover that the student registered with your ESD for homeschooling on May 4th, 2016. So you may report this record in annual ADM for 1920 with the program type 14. ADM enrollment date is going to be the date they signed up with ESD, which is May 4th, 2016. ADM end date is going to be the very next day because it's a 1 day between enrollment and end date. The end date code for this is a 2B because they transferred to homeschool. ADM days present, days absent, session days, and instructional hours and FTE are all going to be 0. And of course, then the tuition code type code is P for paid. Oh, one last thing about this. Even though this happened a really long time ago, we still need to know about it because then we can correctly remove this student from your cohort and not count them as a non-completer. All right, so in the previous example, that program type 14 record could have been put in 1920 annual ADM, or it could have been put in the 2021 first period ADM. But again, putting it in first period requires you then to resubmit it for all subsequent ADM collections for that year, 2021. The reason for this is that when we do our calculations, and I think I just mentioned this a couple slides ago, we use the annual collections for the past 4 to 5 years, but we only use the current year's first period, which in this case is 2021. So remember to have appropriate documentation for the end date code that you're using. And we had an example of a district mistakenly reporting students with 2A when they actually had gone out of state, which should have been a end date code of 2C. The district decided that they were not going to bother correcting the code because it wasn't going to affect their rates from what they thought. However, this action does affect the overall state rates, and it brings up the overall state dropout rate. So remember to update your SSID records for the current year so you don't get errors about students not being active when you try to submit records. And so you also may have to claim students who were claimed by another district since yours, if they haven't been claimed yet this year when you go to submit them into first period. You don't want to trigger those errors as you're trying to get your data in. And do not input any outcomes for which you don't have appropriate documentation. You know, the catchphrase that we invented, if it's not documented, it can't be reported. And so, oh, and I just also wanted to mention, I'm kind of going backwards on the slide, is that during the school closures this year, we did cancel third period cumulative ADM in 1920. All right, so we're going to switch gears and we're going to go into an overview of graduation and dropout reporting. There is a training on October 15th. At least I hope it will be posted by October 15th. It won't be a live training. And that will be going into the validation and reporting rules in much more detail. Currently, as of the day that I'm recording this, which is a couple days before the first, the dropout manual has been published for your and can be accessed for. But the cohort manual, I am waiting for a link. So I do have the correct link to get to those manuals, but the cohort manual at this moment in time is not there. And I hope by in the next week or two, it will be there. So I'm just waiting on a link on the schedule of due days to be created. All right, so graduate, let's see, public release dates. Ooh, yes. So graduation dropout and fall membership data are embargoed until the public release dates. At this point, the release dates for graduation dropout and fall membership are currently to be determined. But we will be announcing in the AA update and in the AA checklist when those dates are determined, what they are. It's important that while these public release dates have not yet occurred, the data that you can preview when it's preliminary and it's final are embargoed. That means that you can only share them with authorized district staff, and this includes not sharing them with your school board. And that is because school board meetings are public meetings, and so they are subject to public information laws. And so you don't want to have a data breach. But you want to share the data with the appropriate district staff. Make sure the people who need to review the data in your district can, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. So just before those public release dates, do not share them with people who are not authorized by your district. Okay, so the changes for this year is we've added a foster care student group as a group that we disaggregate data for. These are students who were in foster care anytime during their high school years that span the cohort reporting, and that would be 16-17 through 19-20 for the 4-year cohort, or 15-16 through 19-20 for the 5-year cohort. Students who have a SE as their EL record type code are excluded from calculation for the English learner and former English learner student groups. SE, which is state of emergency, that code was given to students who were not able to complete the ELPA 21 due to the school closures and the fact that you have to be really close to someone one-on-one to do that test, and that was not safe during our current pandemic emergency. So the third period cumulative ADM, I mentioned once before, did not happen in 19-20. The spring membership extract did not take place as a consequence. So what we did was we took data from annual cumulative ADM and we made a substitute membership that was extracted in September. And from that membership extract, we will be determining students who are in the TAG and economically disadvantaged student groups. We may be doing some refreshes of that. I have not yet determined the schedule for that. And if we end up refreshing it, which I think is likely, but we will not be having as many refreshes as, say, fall membership, okay? But when we have those refreshes, I will try to announce them in the AA update. All right, so there are 3 reports that we put out. The NCES dropout and graduation rates, the four-year cohort graduation rates, and the 5-year cohort graduation rates. All 3 are very different. Well, 4 and 5-year are less different than the dropout grad rate report, but they use different denominators. For NCES, the dropout rate uses the fall membership from last year, from 1920, for grades 9 through 12 as its denominator. The graduation rate for NCES is the number of dropouts plus the number of graduates. The denominator for the 4-year cohort are the students within the 16-17 cohort minus students who are deceased or transferred out of that cohort. 5-year cohort is the adjusted cohort, which are students in the 15-16 year cohort minus students who are deceased or transferred out. So very different groups of students. The graduates for the NCES report are those students who received a regular or modified diploma awarded in the 1920 and the 1920 school year. So that is actually between dates 9/1/19 through August 31st, 2020. The dropouts are defined as the students reported as school year dropouts between 7/1/19 and 6/30/2020. That's the 1920 school year, plus students who were reported as ADM in-date code 3F between 5/1 and 6/30/2019. There are no cohort dropout rates for the 4-year or the 5-year cohort. Graduates in the 4-year cohort are regular or modified diploma earners in the adjusted cohort between 7/1/16 and 8/31/2020. Regular or modified diplomas earned by students in the adjusted cohort for the 5-year earned those diplomas between 7/1/15 and August 31st of 2020. Now, there are major differences between what NCES looks at, and they look at what happens in a single school year, whereas the cohort looks back 4 or 5 years. NCES methodology is our methodology for our official dropout rate. The NCES graduation rate is calculated, but we do not publish it. The cohort methodology is our official graduation rate for Oregon. All right, so this is the calculation we use for the dropout calculation. And that is the number of dropouts in grades 9 through 12 in 1920 divided by the number of students enrolled in grades 9 through 12 on the first school day in October, which would be fall membership. Now, you'll see an asterisk. There are some schools, because they are they have a high mobility rate in an alternative school, or for whatever reason they were not in session during the fall membership snapshot date. We use net enrollment, which is a measure of enrollment throughout the students enrolled at any point throughout the year. And we only use this for a small minority of schools. This year we were a little bit concerned because we were wondering whether there were going to be significant delays because of the forest fires. So we're trying to track which schools had late starts, so we have a heads up if there's a problem with their fall membership data. So the validation for the dropout and graduation rates occurs October 22nd to December 11th. The dropout report, who counts as a dropout? So if a student's last reported event was with one of these following codes, they were a dropout. Okay, and that took place during the 1920 school year. students are only dropouts if the events were their last events. The students who dropped out during the year and then re-enrolled later in the same year and completed the school year are not counted as dropouts. Students who were reported using a dropout code, but then who later re-enrolled by the first school day in October 2020 are not counted as dropouts. ODE processing automatically marks them as non-dropouts if they have first period ADM reporting that indicates that they re-enrolled somewhere. So also, if a student was a no-show, last enrolled in 1819, and then they have a 3F as a ADM in-date code, so they completed the prior school year but then did not re-enroll as expected, and they have end dates for their enrollment in May or June only. These students completed 1819, they were expected to return, but they did not return. Those are also dropouts. So I'm going to show you a graphic that indicates kind of how this works. And this dropout report focuses on, if you want to be realistic, it focuses on a negative result, students who dropped out. And this figure shows only the total of students with those different dropout codes that I showed you. And our state dropout rate is actually between 3 and 4%. Last year it was 3.26%. The students not shown in this circle are the overwhelming majority of students that have the other 20-some ADM in-date codes and had another outcome besides dropping out. So part 2 of the training is going to better show the proportion of students who achieve transfer out or have some other outcome than dropping out. So you're going to first start with students who dropped out in 1920. And those are those in-date codes 3A, 3B, 3C, 3D, 3E, 4B, and 5E. And also 6B. Those are students who may have who earned some graduation credentials but didn't continue. And so we're going to add in the students who completed 1819 but didn't return in 1920. Okay, those were students who had a 3F in-date code. Then we're going to subtract out the students who re-enrolled by October 1st, 2020. And then we're going to subtract out the students who had earned a credential. So they ended up, maybe they dropped out at one school, but then they ended up earning a credential somewhere else. And this also includes students that we're able to match with GED awards. So like I say, these students may appear to be a dropout, but they really weren't. So this ends up being our dropout, which, like I say, was 3.26% of the student population last year. Okay. And you'll be able to see in the validations themselves how you'll be able to see the student level data, and you'll be able to see how students, what proportion of students were in each of those categories. So the graduation rate. We do not publish this. We do have to report it for our federal reports. The rate is calculated and is displayed for validation by you in the validation in ADI, and it's sometimes released in response to data requests. And the calculation is the number of graduates in 1920 divided by the number of graduates plus the number of dropouts. Okay, so the validation for cohort graduation for 4th and 5th year is also October 22nd to December 11th. I had to make it a little bit later this year because exit adjustment ended on the 4th, and the way the weekends fell, I just wanted to make sure everyone had at least a solid week to complete their validation reviews. So the calculation for cohort, and this is basically the same calculation for 4 and 5 year. It just depends on the 4 year are students who began high school in 16-17, and the 5 year are students who began high school in 15-16. And so these are students in the adjusted cohort who earned regular or modified diplomas divided by the adjusted cohort. And I do want to note this, the cohort, which is determined by the high school entry year, is the year that's entered in the current SSID system, not necessarily what was entered in ADM, because the high school entry year may have changed after the ADM record had been submitted, since we're looking at older ADM records. All right, so I'm going to do a quick review on how to set the cohort year. The students' cohort year should be the first year that they were enrolled in any high school anywhere. When a student enters high school in your district, you must review any documentation that they bring with them for prior high school enrollment. If their records indicate high school in another Oregon district, they should already have an SSID number with the correct cohort year. You want to search the SSID to find them, and you do not want to create a new SSID unless you are absolutely certain they do not already have an SSID number. If there is no documentation of prior high school enrollment, you may assign a high school entry year at your discretion based on their first high school enrollment in your district. And I put high school entry year documentation down below for guidance for setting those. And it's a very critical step, as we're going to see in the next slide. Once you set a high school entry year, it is set in stone. You cannot change it. If you need to change it, you have to appeal it. And so be very careful when setting these. Cohort years may be reset if there was a data entry error, if you have new documentation that invalidates the year that you previously set. Cohort years may not be reset solely because a student skips a grade, repeats a grade, or is demoted. A student moves from one district to another. A student spends a year or more not enrolled in school. Your regional ESD partners can help you appeal a currently assigned cohort year, and there is a specific template to appealing the high school entry year. You want to do these appeals early in the process of investigating and validating the cohort and the dropouts, because this process takes a bit of time. And we want to give you some hints as to what makes a more successful appeal. You want to include information about the reason that you believe the cohort year that you're requesting to be changed is inaccurate, and a description of any documentation you have. You want to be as specific and clear as possible. What's helpful is you say something like, we received a transcript from District X showing that the student attended 9th grade in 2015-16, and there is a transcript available. Great, that's good documentation. It's very specific. Another example would be a student enrolled in the U.S. in Oregon for the first time in April 2019 from country X. They were assigned to the 16-17 cohort at the time based on their age. However, we've now received transcripts from their former country, and it's been determined that 18-19 is the more appropriate highest grade from that country. The highest grade that they attended in that country was 8th grade, so not even high school. So what's not helpful is saying a one-sentence reason entered incorrectly or cohort year is incorrect. Those are not helpful. And the regional ESD partners are going to come back to you and say, what's going on? Can you give me some more examples, or some, describe your documentation? So we also had a example last year. We had a lot of changes in the student information system in 1819 because of a particular vendor that no longer serves Oregon. And so there were a lot of consternations locally about SIS operations. And there was a district who had the unfortunate problem where their SIS had been set with a particular default setting that gave every new student a high school entry year, including kindergartner and first graders. And so this district had to make an appeal because their system had assigned a high school entry year to 5 and 6 year olds. And so that was a valid reason for making an appeal, where they said, we have a new SIS system, the defaults were set inaccurate, these kindergartners and first grade students are not in high school, we need to change them to not having a high school entry year in the SSID system. So you want to make sure as you're reviewing your records that the high school entry years that these students you're looking at have make sense with respect to their enrolled grade. So how do we make the cohort? How do we determine those? How do we make the adjusted cohort to determine the rates? We start with all the students from 2016 cohort year, and we subtract out the students who were never enrolled in an Oregon public school or district between July 2016 and July 2020. Now, that first subtraction gives us the unadjusted cohort. Then we subtract out all the students who left the state, students who transferred into private schools or homeschooling, so they transferred out, or students who are deceased or permanently incapacitated. And we're going to go into the rates a lot more in the next training. So this is a graphic to illustrate, the students that we take out to achieve this adjusted cohort. So we have all the students in SSID with the 16-17 cohort year that were enrolled in annual ADM between 2016-17 and 2019-20. Okay, then we're going to subtract out everybody who transferred to a private school. We're going to subtract out everybody who transferred to an ESD registered homeschool. Then we're going to subtract out the kids that moved to another state and enrolled, and we know that they enrolled in a degree granting school in that other state or country. Okay, now getting to the kids that are going home to a country or going to a new country. So we're going to subtract out the students who go to a different country. This includes foreign exchange students who are returning home after they spent time at your district. Subtract those out. And then there are a small number of students every year who are deceased or permanently incapacitated. These students have no chance of coming back to a public school, and we subtract those out. So this is our adjusted cohort. And this is why it's necessary to have appropriate required documentation for documenting those outcomes. Okay, now we take the adjusted cohort, and I'm going to show you the different outcomes within that cohort. We break these down into different outcomes. The largest group is the graduates with regular diplomas. Then there are graduates with modified diplomas. Then there are postgraduate scholars that they may have a regular or a modified diploma, but they're continuing as postgraduate scholars. Then we have students who earned a GED or a adult high school diploma. And we have students who got extended diplomas. Okay. Then we have students who haven't, maybe they're 5 or 6 year seniors and they haven't earned their diploma yet, but they're continuing to try to get that diploma. They're continuing to enroll to get that. And then we have students who earned alternative certificates. And then we have other students that we call other non-completers. So they haven't completed a credential, but they don't really fall into any of the other categories. So the blue outcomes are graduates. The green outcomes are all the students who completed a credential. So we have students who are completers plus students who are graduates. And then the pink area is students who we classify as non-completers because they haven't finished something. They may finish something, but they haven't finished something yet. The graduation rate is calculated by taking the number of graduates divided by the size of the total adjusted cohort. And we also do a completer rate by taking the number of graduates plus completers divided by the whole adjusted cohort. So graduates are students with a regular or modified high school diploma that they earned for the 4-year cohort between July 1st, 2016 and August 31st, 2020. The 5-year cohort is students who received a diploma between July 1st, 2015 and August 31st, 2020. Graduates are going to have ADM Inday codes of 4A, 4F, or 4G. They're going to have an ADM diploma type code of 1 or 2. And completers are graduates plus students with a GED, adult high school diploma or extended diploma. They're going to have an in-date code of 4E or 4A and a diploma type code of 3 or 4. These also include students that are identified as part of a GED matched list that we get from either the GED Corporation or we get it from the Higher Education Coordinating Council. That data, we are working on getting it. We haven't received it yet. So hopefully we will get it before the validation starts on October 22nd. Okay, typically the dropout rate is between 3 and 4%, and the graduation rate is between 70 and 80. It's been increasing. It finally hit 80 last year, but there are many reasons why the graduation and dropout rates do not total 100%. Not all of the non-completers are dropouts. This year's 5-year rate is not necessarily higher than the 4-year rate for a given school and student group. So graduation, let's see, the graduation dropout reports, the cohort graduation and dropout report use different methodologies. The dropout rate is a 1-year calculation. It's using a completely different set of students from the cohort rates, although some of the students are in both of those groups for a single year, the rates are not comparable. Graduation and dropout are not the only 2 outcomes for students. Many students earn alternative certificates or they continue their enrollment. Other non-completers may have left school temporarily because they have a medical issue or they have a disciplinary issue. Students who left school temporarily for medical or disciplinary reasons are not considered considered non-completers, but they are for cohort, but they are not counted as dropouts because we know what happened to them and they may be coming back to that school. This year's 5-year rate is not necessarily higher than the 4-year rate, and the 2 rates are based on 2 completely separate sets of students. The 5-year rate is based on students who started high school in 2015, 2016. The 4-year rate is based on students who started high school in 16, 17. This year's 5-year rate corresponds more closely to last year's 4-year rate But even then, there could be some differences. In general, the 5-year rate is higher than last year's 4-year rate, but that's not always the case because we could have, within the space of a year, additional transfers into the cohort that sometimes cause the 5-year rate to be lower than the 4-year rate for the same cohort of students. Okay. So graduation and dropout recording, who is responsible for the student in terms of accountability? Generally, this is the student's last resident district in school. There are some exceptions for non-accountable institutions. Sometimes this is generally not seen, though, for private alternative placements. We've kind of tightened up the business rules, so some of the, so usually the resident district in school are accountable. In some of the older records, you see some variability, but we're going to talk about this in more detail about who is accountable and how we determine that in the October 15th training. Okay, so my student is a 9th grader this year, but I need to go back and add records for them to the 1920 ADM when they were an 8th grader. What do I put for a high school entry year? Okay, these are frequently asked questions in our data submission. So I'm going to go through several examples now. We will be using that student's high school entry year that the student was assigned an SSID. You may report records in ADM with a high school entry year, likely 2021, with an enrolled grade of 8 or lower. High school entry years must match the value currently assigned in the SSID system. And there are no validations which check the enrolled grade against the high school entry year unless the high school entry year has been left blank when it's required. That may trigger an error, but we don't have any good validations for that. Okay, the next frequently asked questions. I submitted a type 14 record but got this error message, and the error description is the student record matching the submitted secure student identifier SSID is not effective and needs to be updated. Okay, you have to update your student records in SSID before you can complete first period and add new records for the student, even if those records are for old events. So you want to search for the student's record in SSID, click and that would be SSID and Consolidated Collections Record Maintenance, and click the green edit check mark, and that's if your search returns more than one result, and update the resident and attending institutions if necessary, and click the save button. That's to individually activate an old record in the SSID system for a student. All right, transferring to another institution. We're going to go through some similar outcomes students have, and so when to use what code. If the institution is another Oregon school district, use 2A. If the institution is a public program that does not offer a high school diploma, use 2D. That would be like JDAP. If the institution offers a program leading to a high school diploma, and this could include private schools or home schools and some of the Job Corps locations, or the student has moved to another country, then you want to use 2B if the program is in Oregon, or 2C if it's outside of Oregon. If there is no secondary education program where they have transferred to, use 3C or 3D. 3D is adult education, like Job Corps that don't offer high school diplomas, and 3C is disciplinary reasons for this student transferring out. Right, Transferring to another institution, some more examples. If the institution offers a program leading to a college degree and the student has not earned a credential from your district and is no longer being tracked or funded by your district, then use 5D. Do not include expanded options or other college credit programs where the students are still enrolled. Okay, this could be an early college admissions program. If the student is currently pursuing a bachelor's degree in this early college admissions program, and you have documentation of this, please let ODE know by email, because we need to apply an override in our calculations so that this student is counted and subtracted out appropriately. When we were looking at this, we realized we didn't have descriptions of what appropriate documentation in the ADM manual would be for a 5D student. And we thought that documentation would be an acceptance letter or a registration receipt. But again, something in writing to show that this student was at this other institution. Transferring to a non-traditional setting that is off campus or an extension of the district is tracked by the district, and then you would use a 1B or a 1C. Now, we had a question about this actually this week, where a student was going there. They were still being tracked by their district. They were being placed by their district, and the district and their school were the resident district and school, but they were attending an ESD school. So the most appropriate indate code for them was 1B, because it was a ESD school in Oregon. Transferring to a non-traditional setting like a residential facility, correctional institute, community or technical college program that is not approved or tracked by the district, you're going to use a 3D. If the student has met all their diploma requirements, was awarded a diploma, and is not expected or eligible to participate in postgraduate scholars, use 4A. If the student is both eligible and participating in postgraduate scholars, use 4G. If the student has met all of their diploma requirements but has been enrolled in high school for fewer than 4 years and is continuing their enrollment to pursue a higher tier diploma instead of being awarded the diploma that they have met requirements for, use 4F. 4F was common several years ago before we started postgraduate scholars, but now it's not really commonly used or applies anymore. 4Bs are students which completed the credit requirements for the diploma, but there were other district-defined project requirements or other diploma requirements that they did not meet, and they are not returning, and these are a kind of a dropout. 4Bs are considered dropouts. So there are other credentials like modified diplomas. You're going to use 4A or 4F, and diploma type code 2. Depending on if they are gone or if they're going to re-enroll. Extended diplomas, you're going to use 4A, diploma type code 4. Alternative certificates, use 4C. The district-defined alternative certificates are not students who are dropping out, but they are not graduates or completers. There are adult high school diplomas, and they must be documented by your district, but they don't need to be awarded by your district. You're going to use 4A with diploma type code 3. Students getting a GED, this also must be documented by your district, but it does not need to be awarded by your district, and those students get a 4E. If the student completed all required courses but did not meet other diploma requirements and is not returning, use 4B. If the student finished the school year and did not complete all diploma requirements but will return, you can use code 1A. But if they do not return and are not enrolled in first period, then change this to a 3F. If the student did not complete all required courses and is not expected to return, you could use 3A or 3E depending on when, what you know about the student's situation and when they left during the school year. So 3A is where you know why a student left. 3E would be they left before the end of school year and you really don't know what happened with them. Okay, so students who are not attending for health reasons. 5B can be used for long-term illnesses and 1A can be used for short-term illnesses. And between long-term and short-term illnesses is sort of a district discretion. If the illness is not verified, you need to use code 3A. If a student is deceased or permanently incapacitated, you're going to use in-date code 6A. And the difference between permanently incapacitated under a 6A versus, say, a 5B, where they have a long-term severe illness, is 5B, these students have a chance to come back to school. They could re-enroll in the future if they recover enough or have appropriate accommodations. These students who are permanently incapacitated and you're using code 6A, these students have no chance to return. They are not expected to ever come back. So students withdrew after earning a credential. If the credential was previously awarded, you want to use a 6B. If your district awarded the credential, make sure that it was reported to ODE with the appropriate award date as a program type 14 record usually, or it could be annual ADM. In this final, on this final record, we need you to use 6B appropriately, and so this will allow us to subtract out the student from our rates if we need to, and that we aren't double counting the student. So if the credential was not awarded, for example, a 4F, award and report the credential. Okay, if a student was suspended or expelled, and this example is really for records that occurred before the state of emergency conditions. So if the student is not in school, I'm going to let you read this slide on your own because it's not going to apply to very many students. This example was considering the 10-day drop rule, which has been since suspended. So, you can come back and look at this one on your own. Okay, students who enroll in expanded options or in other college programs, students before earning a diploma or other credentials, students who enroll in district level programs or GED prep programs or private placements that are tracked and tuitioned by the district. So these are students who are kind of in some special examples, special circumstances. If these students are enrolled in any of these special conditions, but then they drop out, they are considered dropouts and they need to be reported following the same rules as students in standard programs. So, and this is the final frequently asked question that we get. Students who enroll in postgraduate scholars and other programs after being awarded a diploma or other credential and then leave are not dropouts because they got a credential first and they need to be reported as a 6B ADM end-date code on their last enrollment record. And you'll be using a program type 14 record to add that 6B ADM end-date codes if necessary. So again, that keeps us from double counting them. Okay, so the next training is on October 15th, and it's going to go into the validations for graduation and dropout rates. There will be more details on student outcomes. There will be discussion on how student group membership is determined, how a student's accountable district and school are determined, and how do I access and interpret the validations. And please, this training would be very helpful for any of your staff who are reviewing your data. So the first training, this training is seen by a lot of data submitters, but if you have principals and superintendents who are going to be reviewing that data, special ed administrators, you want to have them see this next training because it's really going to explain what they're looking at and how they're making sense of their data. So what should you do now before October 22nd? You should clean up any remaining audits that you had in 1920 annual cumulative ADM. If you had any audits, you would have got those in July, and you have not yet addressed them. Then you should finish submitting your first period cumulative ADM for 2021, and that's to see the most accurate calculated intake codes for your students. And it's also to help out your colleagues in other districts see the most accurate codes for their students. Also important, this is also important for dropout and cohort graduation outcomes. And don't forget to add your summer graduates. Then, I'll just give you a hint. This is 5 things on this list. You're going to download a list of your students from your district from the SSID collection, and you're going to look over your students with the 2015-2016 or the 2016-2017 cohort years and make sure that those high school entry years are accurate. This is column AH, high school entry year, in the SSID production download. You're going to make sure that everyone in your district who needs access to the validations has access, even the charter schools. You're going to contact your district security administrator if you need to add or remove someone's permissions. And again, you need individual access to every validation in ADI separately, as well as having access to ADI itself. So you want to make sure everyone who can see their data, who needs to see their data, can see their data. Finally, we're going to work on exit adjustment and make sure that all your outcomes are reported correctly. You're going to request a production download of your 3F students and review those. You're going to request a production download of any students whose calculated intake code does not match their submitted intake code and review those. You're going to request a complete production download, and those production download lists were on slide 15. You're going to do a complete production download of annual cumulative ADM in 1920, and you're going to check for the following. Are all your graduates reported, including summer graduates? For any students reported with a 4B, make sure that they did not receive any credential. For any students who reported with a 4F or 4G, make sure they've re-enrolled in first period. For any students reported with a 6A, 2A, 2B, 2C, or 2D, make sure you have the appropriate documentation for them. For 2A, ensure that you have the transfer documentation from another public school district, school or school district on file, and SSID entries do not qualify as documentation. Look for mismatches between enrolled grade and high school entry year, and make sure that your high school entry years are correct for those students. And continue on number 5, in your work in exit adjustment, you're going to look over really closely students who have ADM intake codes of 3E and 3F. Do you have a lot of them? I might be sending you an email about that. Do you have updates for these students? Can you contact their family to see what their status is and if they've enrolled elsewhere? And obtain the required documentation of enrollment. Because if it's not documented, you can't report it. So we've talked about there's no validations of high school entry year and grade level. and we have talked about what sorts of questions you need to be asking yourself about dropout codes. Students with dropout codes. Another thing that you should do is communicate with your special education director, because graduation and dropout data are used in the special education system's performance review and improvement reports. And sometimes there's a lag between districts being flagged with coding errors and the data getting to the district before they have a chance to fix those. So this could give you and your director a heads up, and you want to make sure that that director has access to the cohort and dropout data validations so that they can check on their special education students who are earning credentials. You want to communicate with your high school administrators. Make sure registrars, high school principals, and other relevant staff have access to the validation in time to make corrections. You want to ask staff to alert you as to what needs to be edited within the collection that will update the validation and your SIS. And of course, you want to do that quickly. There's a lot of things to get done this fall, and this closes December 11th, right before the holidays, so you want to get on the ball with this. And of course, you have lots of help. Oh, sorry, one last thing. Reach out to the charter schools in your district that offer high school grades to make sure that they have access to reviewing this data and can alert you to any problems or errors that they have. And you have lots of resources for figuring out what in-date code do they need, what kind of diploma do they have, are they a dropout, all those questions, high school entry years, are they right, do I need to change them? So we have lots of information online for you. And finally, we have humans that are amazing, outstanding resources, our regional ESD partners. You have myself and you have Amanda Leopard to help you. And so we hope we can help you, and we hope this process goes well. And thank you so much for listening to this very lengthy training. And I will see you again on October 15th. If you need to reach me by phone, like I mentioned earlier, that is sort of problematic. Sending me an email and asking me to call you back is probably the best way to go. So I hope things go well, and I will see you in 2 weeks for the graduation and dropout validation trainings. Thank you.